All right, thanks so much. It's great to see everybody. It's been a minute since I've been on a stage doing this kind of thing, so I would like to just tell you a few stories and give you, I think, a few practical tips about how the UX research practice has grown at Indeed since I've been there. I'm just going to do the old, like, tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then tell you, and then tell you what I told you kind of approach here to this. So I'm going to cover just 3 topics, and I will tell you some stories along the way, and hopefully give you some ideas that you can take back to your teams. I'll talk about show, don't tell, lessons from improv, and then end with strive for balance. And all of these strategies are meant to just really help your qualitative research practice, since we're at a qual conference, to just really get a more strategic position in the company, really get that seat at the table. But first, I'm going to talk about 2016. So I joined Indeed close to the end of 2016, and I don't know if you guys were looking for work that year, but this is what Indeed looked like. This is actually a screenshot from early 2017, but this is essentially what Indeed looked like. And Indeed had been hugely successful, like massively successful. And at the time that I joined, I was the second researcher to join, the first researcher ever to be on the job seeker side of the house. We had employer, posting jobs, research into that. But I was the first researcher, and Indeed had been hugely successful in a very data-driven, but largely in a quantitative sense. So when I arrived at Indeed, product managers, designers, all the leadership, they were all talking in terms of hypotheses and experiments and A/B testing and statistical significance. And I was like, this is great. I'm going to love working here because everyone's already a researcher. This is going to be great. And they would talk about things like, running these experiments. Somebody might say, well, let's instead of the button saying find jobs, maybe we should have that button say search jobs. So let's try it. We had, at the time, 250 million job seekers a month doing billions of searches on our site. And so we could very quickly get to a place where we found out if that changing the label from find to search would make a difference. And usually it did, like very small difference probably, but we could measure that. And so I started asking about these A/B tests, and I'm like, this is great. We can measure really small differences. We have all this data. What happened when you talked to job seekers about that? And they said, oh, no, we don't do that. We don't talk to people. So I was like, oh, this is good. I have a job. This is good. Everybody's a researcher, sort of, but nobody's doing qual. So I really started just developing a qual practice at Indeed. And one of the things I did is I created this comic. It looks like the XKCD comic, but I found a comic generator online. But it's really, it's not as funny if I read it to you, but I will anyway. So, imagine you're at a conference like this and you say, like, who loves qual more than quant, or quant more than qual? Everybody raises their hand because they love quant. And I'm like, why? Why do you love quant? And then they start to explain, well, quant is great because, and then you're like, no, just tell me in numbers. Tell me in numbers why you love quant. And the guy says, 7? So it was kind of making a joke and making light of the fact, but really, explaining quant, telling the story, framing what you know from quant, that's qual. And you can either base your qual on kind of your assumptions or your background or what you think it might be, or you could base that on data that you've collected. So this was just kind of an early thing that I shared with the team to say, like, this is about understanding the data that we have. And I love what Nick was saying about it's all data. We had and continue to have, I think, in pockets, problems with people at Indeed using the word data to mean quant only. So I kind of have to always say there's other kinds of data. All right, so that was just a little background about my starting out at Indeed, but I want to give you just a few practical tips and tell you some stories along the way too. My first point is show, don't tell. And I mentioned in 2016, I was the only researcher on the job seeker side of the house. And I think there are a lot of people who, you know, to get that seat at the table, to start having that strategic impact, they kind of start with explaining what the research can do and how valuable qualitative research can be, and what are the things that you're going to see. And I think that the lesson here is maybe just get started. The other researcher on the employer side that was also relatively new to Indeed at the time, we both had this idea of, let's just do the research, show the value, get people excited about it, not do a lot of like, let's get alignment, not a lot of like, let me explain my background and why you should trust me, all this kind of stuff. Let's just like immediately start showing value. And that began with a lot of, you know, as we talked about a minute ago, a lot of like very early evaluative stuff, you know, like, well, let's just get these experiences in front of people and have them start interviewing them about it. So I'd say this is a strategy that we employed. Get started. The other part of it is stay visible, and there's a lot of pieces to this. But another thing that we did early on, in addition to just getting started, just start finding out what teams need to know, and executing on answering their questions. The other part of that is be visible, and there are a lot of researchers that talk about the value of making sure that you deliver durable research, like make sure that you are not just answering, you know, kind of the ephemeral, like very questions that are going to be obsolete, providing insights that are going to be obsolete. Like it's about staying visible and creating those durable insights. And we did a really simple thing and stood up a WordPress blog site that after each study, we just post one blog article to that site. And so we've got this archive that's been running since 2017 with, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 reports in there at this point. And every Tuesday, about 7,000 people at Indeed get the email, here's what we learned this week. And, you know, it was pretty meager in the beginning. We maybe had 1 or 2 studies coming out every week. At this point, I think we're at like 15 to 20 a week, you know, from all across the company. And it's just, here are the studies, and people can click through and read those. So we're really always thinking about how can we be both proactive in getting started on things, and also just staying visible and making sure that we're sharing what we create. Okay, so that's show, don't tell. The next section I'll talk to you about is some of my favorite. It's lessons from improv, and I'm not. This should say 2 up there. There's a few typos. We can address those later. But in lessons from improv, and I'm not advocating that everybody join an improv troupe. I've never performed in an improv troupe. I actually don't even advocate that everybody does like a mandatory improv team building thing either. But I think that improv is a really interesting view into team dynamics. And I think there are a few lessons from improv that you can apply to your everyday work. And so I'll take some excerpts from, famous, she's not a researcher, but famous improv and creator Tina Fey. But the first one I want to talk about is this concept of yes and. And if you've done any of these terrible mandatory, business training improv things, it's like, there's a game where you have to agree with the person who's telling a story before you and sort of add to it. There's a couple people I can tell that have actually sat in that training before. But there's 2 components to this yes and approach, and this is something I tell the researchers on my team. The first one, yes, is really about agreement. And this is from Tina Fey's book, but it just, agreement reminds you to respect what your partner has created and at least start from an open-minded place and so she says, start with yes and see where that takes you. And this is just a valuable thing from improv, but I think it also applies to who we are as research teams. in different companies where I've worked, I've seen a lot of researchers say, well, we can't, or that's not how we do it, or that's, you want something that's impossible, or like, that's not a great research question in the first place. So what you do is you're kind of shutting down the people around you. You're shutting down your stakeholders. So it's really about starting with agreement and seeing where that takes you. And that gets you a little bit further into that strategic seat at the table. The and part, the second part of the yes and, is like, don't be afraid to contribute. In fact, it's your responsibility to contribute. Always make sure you're adding something to discussions and your initiations are worthwhile. And if we put this in like sort of a business context and about getting that strategic seat at the table, it's doing more, adding to what may be a terrible research question, It may be, well, that's not really the deeper insight that we need to get to, or that particular approach is, we've got stakeholders that say, hey, I need a survey, and we're like, maybe you need a survey. Let's talk about that. What do you want to know? And really just getting in deep with our partners and contributing and making it into something more. I talked about just getting started, but what we often do is, hey, we need to do, an evaluative study of this new feature. That's great. We'll get in there and we'll give you some feedback that's really like, does this feature make sense? Is it comprehensible? Are there any usability problems maybe? But also, here's a little bit about the mental model. Here's a little bit about why users are, interpreting this feature this way. And here are some opportunities that you might have. So it's really about delivering more. So that's the yes and part. The other lesson from improv that I'll talk about is this idea of making statements. So improv, Tina Fey again, she says that making statements is this positive way of saying don't ask questions all the time. And so like if you think about improv and this idea that you're in a scene, it's not a lot of just showing up to the scene, asking like, where are we? What's going on? It's rather contributing your own thing to the scene. And so in a business context, really just trying to figure out what can I contribute? How can I like add to? How can I continue to like move this along? And it's really about being part of the solution. So we've all worked with those people. We've all worked with those people about, it's their whole desire is to sort of poke holes, throw a monkey wrench into your plans. Why are you asking it this way? Like, why is this a survey and not depth interviews? Whatever it happens to be. That's like a lot of this, like how to get a strategic seat at the table is to be seen as a true partner, more open and accepting and contributing. All right. I want to tell a story for this last one, but if you think about improv, some of the things that I think are most amazing about improv is watching a troupe. And I do go watch improv. I have some friends that are in the improv scene in Austin. But the interesting thing about it is like really seeing them make decisions about when to enter, when to, like when they do feel like that their contribution can be worked in and all that sort of thing. And I want to tell a quick story how this relates to getting a seat at the table. Early on in my tenure at Indeed, I got an invitation from the CEO to sort of talk about like what is my philosophy around research, and I put together this kind of great deck about where we were, what value we were adding to the company, where I wanted to go, what was our mission statement, all that sort of stuff. And at the end, the CEO was like, "This is great." And then he paused and he said, "I heard a story one time about a company who they just had like a standing panel of users that would come in every Friday. And so rather than waiting for design a study, you know, go through all the process, get the results back. Anybody at the company, if they had a question, they could just show up that Friday. The longest you'd have to wait is 7 days to, you know, ask your questions directly of the users. And luckily, I was thinking on my feet, because that was like a hard one, because it's the CEO, what do you say? I said, you know what's better than waiting for 7 days for, you know, to ask a user? I said, it's when, you know, maybe a product manager has a question and we already have the answer. That's a lot faster than 7 days, and we can do it in a way that's a lot more robust than just like asking whoever we happen to have in that Friday. And so the philosophy that we've followed at Indeed has always been deeply embedding researchers on teams. So if there's a, you know, there's a team, for example, on the search, job search pages, and there's a team on resumes, and there's a team on all these things. What we want to do is have those researchers anticipate where the teams are going to be. What do they need to know, not tomorrow, and don't wait for them to ask, but rather anticipate 4 months, not 4 months, that's probably a little far out. 4 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now, where are those teams going? What's their trajectory, and how can we arrive before them? How can we basically scout out in front of where the teams are going so that we can be relied upon? I think a real problem with research is that it's always, you know, too slow, too expensive. We have those critiques that happen. But I think good research can happen when you deeply embed and anticipate and be proactive about planning out those roadmaps. All right, I'm on my third one. I have no idea how I'm doing on time, but get your questions ready. The third point that I want to make is around strive for balance. And we've talked a lot about qual and quant working together. I won't rehash all of those things, but I really believe in those things. So like, I think those are really good lessons. I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A. But when I think about strive for balance, it's something that's more recently come up at Indeed, because we've really been, I think, focused on how do we provide that really deep strategic insight. And so we're focusing a lot on very generative work. It's highly impactful the earlier that you can get to provide this like deep understanding of who your users are, who your customers are. And it really just informs roadmaps. I mean, it's so early and so foundational that it changes the direction of where teams are headed. And I would call this, I've started calling it this, I'm practicing it out on this audience. It's basically research that informs the future. So it's all of this strategic generative work really is the future direction of the company. But I think that leaves out like some other research. It leaves out some other opportunities to provide value to the company. So we're over here in the future, but really it's like, well, what about, you know, the past and the present? And so this strive for balance that I want to talk about is really about filling out both the past and the present here. And I want to talk about that just a little bit. So going from the future, where you might be doing a lot of this generative work and providing this foundational understanding so that teams can build roadmaps, you also need to step back and evaluate what is your current offering. It's really like tapping into feedback that your customers are providing. Maybe that's social, maybe that's, you know, help desk type things, or just evaluative research. You may need to just put your current offerings in front of people and just understand how they're responding to those things. So it's really about assessing things that you've launched in the past. And at Indeed, this whole year is really about, we've got some big initiatives around doing just that, around assessing what's out there live today so that we can know where to improve those things. So we've got past and we've got future. And in the middle, we have what I would call the work and the present. And this is sort of in the iterative design process. We have, you know, more of an agile design process where again, I mentioned that we run experiments. We're always, like trying to tweak things and make things a little bit more effective. But we really, when we did all the strategic work, we kind of lost that middle space, that the present work. What are the designers working on? What are the new features under development? Because what would happen is we would really go for what is the most impactful thing that we can do, and we sort of skimped, I think, and we reduced our support of this middle process. And again, this year we've got a new team that's really about how do we rapidly iterate? How do we get feedback all the time? So that one is really about, oh, see, that's a terrible typo. I didn't see that before. This one is about the present. Like, how do we support the teams that are working right now to inform those iterations? All right, so to recap, show, don't tell. Just get started. Again, just try to stay visible. Lessons from improv, remember yes and. Remember, make statements. And go deeply embedded, like be proactive about research. And then finally, strive for balance. Make sure that you're balancing the research that you're doing across that future, past, and present, across all three of those categories. And that's my talk. Questions?
Okay, we do have time for questions, so we're doing great on time. Any questions for Dave?
I have a question.
Yes.
And a mic.
All right.
So the blogs that you've been posting,
Yep.
Do you put resources against that to find what is being used regularly and then iterate on that?
That's a great question. So to rephrase that, it sounds like what you're wondering is, do we track kind of analytics on the blog? Do we, who's reading it, when, that sort of thing? We probably haven't done enough of that. But I do know we have, for example, like Google Analytics, and once a year, we have a big research summit where we bring together UX researchers from across the company together, and a lot of times we'll have kind of like research by the numbers day, and we'll be able to say like, well, this is the most popular article, like, that sort of thing. Who contributed the most number of reports to the we call it the research library. We do kind of retrospectively look at that sometimes, but it's not what I would call kind of somebody actively managing that and driving that. It's a pretty passive thing right now. We send out about 7,000 emails, I mentioned, a week. And we have, things like open rates and things like that. We can see like newer articles getting spikes and things like that. But yeah, I don't know that we use it enough to like really drive. If we were to think about how do we like kind of treat that like its own product by itself? Like how do we get more people to look at this? So, but that's a really great question. It might happen this year. One of my colleagues, again, on the employer side, they did talk about like maybe we need a research librarian, and I've known that there are other companies that do that sort of thing. So that could be coming. It's a great question.
Oh, thank you. I think I'm going to ask a question each time. But thanks so much for the talk. For your weekly share out that you mentioned, I think that's a great idea, either monthly or weekly. How do you recommend sharing out qualitative feedback? Especially to maybe teams that, will come back and say, well, that's just one person or that's just 5 people. So how do you, because one thing I've found is I share out UX, literally my product team will watch folks fumbling through our digital products, and it's really eye-opening for them to actually see what's really going on versus what they think is going on in their heads. But the monthly or weekly share out is a great idea. So how do you recommend sharing out?
Yeah, and I should talk more broadly about that. That weekly email is kind of our broad distribution of things. But as I mentioned, we are deeply embedded with the product teams that are working on a particular feature or product area. And so that team, not only, when you're working with your core team, it's about attending the sessions, seeing this in real time, like having the discussions afterward, maybe a debrief at the end of the day. We've watched 5 people struggle with these things, let's talk about it. And then, once the researcher prepares the report, there's an official readout. That's where you might play some highlight videos. That's where you might, again, have those discussions. I really like it when researchers take, the last 10 minutes of that meeting to say, all right, what are we going to do next? What are the decisions that we're going to make based on this research that we just did? And it's only the very last step that we post it to the blog and blast that email. That last step is really just kind of a catch-all, anybody else. Another thing that we do is we maintain a research calendar. Not that anybody looks at it that often, but it makes it easy to share and see, okay, we have these, you may not have been aware of these sessions that happened, but here's the report. It's going to be shared out, and we can invite, anybody to attend those. So I will say that be visible point that I made isn't just this sort of broad communication thing that we're doing. It's also every step along the way. It's a great question.
Dave, thank you for your talk today.
Yeah.
My name is Jerry Hazelmeyer, and the question that I have is, in the tech space, Agile has been a real driver in some of your processes. And what I'm wondering about is, has Agile impacted the way you do qual and quant? Mm-hmm. And I just was wondering your take on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've seen it happen a couple of different ways. But I would say that the part that I talked about in terms of anticipate, being proactive and sort of getting out ahead, that's really critical. I don't think that research can happen in a 2-week sprint, especially if the definition of the research happens at the beginning of that 2 weeks. There's just no way to really fit that in. However, if you can look at the backlog, if you can look at kind of where teams, where some of their issues are stacking up and things that they plan to get to in the future, you can go there and start to anticipate, oh, okay, if they're going this direction, and we don't know exactly when they'll be there because Agile, they're just, working in these 2-week chunks. But that they're going to get there eventually, then it's go ahead and do that research. The problem that happens, and I'm glad you brought this up, the problem that happens is, we're all about being proactive and creating these roadmaps that may be 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks out. Teams might turn, they might pivot to a thing. So the visual that I have is the researcher goes down the road and starts this research and gets out in front to scout out where they're headed, and the team takes the other fork. And so the researcher is down the wrong road. This happens sometimes, I will say. There will be a study that gets completed that doesn't apply to where the team ended up pivoting. I would say that I'm willing to have that happen sometimes. For the other 2 or 3 times where the team's hey, we're thinking about, and then we're no, here it is. There it is. There's the research. That's all you need. Keep going fast. They don't miss a beat. So anyway, I hope that kind of answers some of your questions about how Agile works in this.
Hi, Dave.
Yep.
Thanks for your very clearly and organized presentation. I'm thinking about the number of years that you and your team have generated research at this point. 2016 to 2022 is not a short amount of time. It's a lot of blog posts. It's a lot of Tuesday emails.
Yep.
And now you're talking about a research librarian. Organizing and making research accessible at the right time to people in a DIY fashion has been, a struggle that many companies, notoriously Facebook, Google, have had for a long time. So I'm wondering, how do you kind of build from that past piece of your research model, your framework, and how do you make that accessible to other people beyond just relying on the embedded researcher to be the librarian for that team?
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. And I'll tell you my answer to it, and I don't think I'm, you know, there are probably other answers and other ideas about this. One of the things that we rely heavily on are what we sometimes call them meta studies or roll-ups. So there are different points in the process where, you know, maybe there's a bunch of new people on the team. Maybe it's like, you know, we need to have the, you know, define the next vision of where this product is going. Researchers will often put on their backlog in their roadmap a roll-up or a meta study. And so that's everything that we know about resumes or everything we know about the application process. And that is a way to sort of gather together the more, and again, as we add more and more insights, there are things that become amazingly stable. So, you know, one of the things I could ask is like, who wants job descriptions to have a salary? You know, like, hey, that turns out to be like a huge pain point for everybody all the time, every day of the week, you know, that sort of thing. But anyway, these roll-ups and meta studies are a good way for us to do that. It also works great if there's like a new researcher to the area. They're, you know, supporting the apply team. They don't really know it all, so they're going to go through and read all that stuff. One of the things that we did, and this actually happened during the pandemic, we had a bit of a hiring freeze early in the pandemic. We were shorthanded, and we really needed teams to reference our existing research rather than requesting new stuff all the time. And so we went through this process, and we called it the top 10s. Maybe I like Dave Letterman too much or something, but like we called it top 10s, and we picked different product areas, and each researcher on the team at the time was designated like, all right, you talk about, I don't know, you know, my examples are kind of running out, but job search, you talk about researching companies, you talk about the application process, and each researcher came up with like the 10 highlights for that area that was cross-referenced. All these things are cross-referenced to the original research, so if you want to go deeper, but we gave this kind of series of, I don't know, you call it like readouts or lecture series, and we invited kind of a panel of people, not just the researcher, but maybe a couple others to present. All right, here's the top 10 things you need to know about this area. They presented, and there was like Q&A. So I guess they were probably webinars, for lack of a better terminology there. But yeah, so hopefully that answers your question a bit.
Okay. This is our last question.
Last one, time to sneak it in. Two things, both of them are really more observations. One is, I think it's really great the way that you have infused research throughout the whole decision-making process, because I see a lot of organizations where research is brought in at the last minute, at the end of the sequence, and you're giving them a seat at the table early in the process, which I think is very good and very smart. My other sort of observation / question is, how do you manage that arc of knowledge over time? Because people come and go, management comes and goes. Mm-hmm. How do you institutionalize the learning that you capture at various points in time to make sure that you aren't repeating the same mistakes, projects, mm-hmm. you know, et cetera, et cetera? So those are sort of my two comments. Thank you.
Yeah. Two comments. I'll give you two different answers. So first answer for the second half of your question, which was, you know, how do you avoid repeating yourself? We don't. We don't avoid repeating ourselves. And I would say that I've really, over the years, come to not really when people say, we want to avoid duplication of efforts, we want to make sure that we're being efficient, I've just kind of leaned into it and said, nah, this is just triangulation. It's just replicating a previous study. We may add like a different thing to it. We're just building up over time. I think that there are many times, for example, where we know something, but again, back to show, don't tell. We may know something and we may have plenty of research that we are completely confident in it, but the team doesn't know it yet. And sometimes they have to go through that process of going to those sessions, sitting in on that to really be brought along. There's a colleague at Indeed, his name is Jay Rogers, who he talks about it in terms of the actionable zone, which I really like. I'm going to try to work that into future versions of this, but it's really like where can the team actually like take action? If you're too close, then like your research is going to be minimally effective. If you're too far out, if you're like, oh, here's the 5-year vision, teams don't know what to do tomorrow with that. You know, it's too far out. So it's really finding that actionable zone and really thinking about what do teams really need to know now and how can we move them in that direction. To your other comment, which I think is more about, we sometimes call it like educating stakeholders, right? Maybe it's, you know, research literacy or, you know, what value research can bring or how to ask a great research question. It's wildly all over the map, how much our stakeholders know and how much of a partner they are. And I think that is just a constant job of the researcher to level up everyone around them and make sure that those teams are getting the most out of what research can bring.
All right. Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you.